Hey guys, tonight we travel to ancient Athens, where the marble is cool under your feet, oil lamps flicker in doorways, and every whisper carries just a little too far. It's a city that gave birth to democracy, philosophy, and deeply public sex lives. You're not sneaking off for any private romantic moment here, because privacy as we know it hasn't been invented yet. You're about to find yourself navigating a culture where bedroom doors don't quite shut, love stories are painted on pottery, and half the city knows who kissed whom before breakfast. You probably won't survive this reality with your modern sense of modesty intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing this sleepy little community grow. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive in Athens just as dusk is settling. The air smells of olive oil, fig leaves, and a hint of something smoky. Maybe burnt offerings, maybe just dinner gone slightly wrong. Your sandals scuff the uneven stones of the agora, the city's bustling heart. But by now it's quieter. The bakers have packed up, the philosophers are mid-rant under the colonnades, and somewhere nearby, a flute plays just slightly out of tune. You don't know it yet, but every conversation you overhear might include politics, gossip, or someone's sex life. Probably all three. Athenian society doesn't draw a neat line between public and private. Houses are built inward around courtyards, but voices carry and doors are more symbolic than solid. If someone in your neighborhood sneezes or sighs with pleasure, you hear it. The thin walls are no match for curiosity. That's partly because Athenians don't really want secrets. They prize openness. Opinions are shared in public. Reputations live and die in the agora, and personal habits, including bedroom ones, are considered fair game for scrutiny. You duck past a group of young men lounging near a wine shop. They're half drunk, fully loud, and throwing around insults that to you sound suspiciously like compliments. One calls another more seductive than Alcibiades, which earns a round of laughter and a few mockingly blown kisses. Alcibiades, of course, is the city's golden boy / troublemaker. A general, a seducer, and eventually a traitor, but for now, just a benchmark for beauty and ambition. You pass a doorway hung with fabric, barely a curtain, and glance in. Inside, a man and a woman are arguing, or maybe flirting, while an older woman sits nearby threading a loom. No one seems concerned that you're watching. That's just life here. The Athenians don't have bedrooms like we do. Rooms aren't divided by purpose but by gender. Men have the andron, the male space for drinking parties and debate. Women occupy the gynaeconitis, mostly upstairs, mostly out of sight. But those spaces bleed together. Lovers sneak between them. Children wander. Nothing is ever entirely closed off. And in a way, sex itself is communal. Not physically, usually, but conceptually. It's discussed at length in symposia, painted on pottery, embedded in theater jokes, and whispered behind fans in courtrooms. Athenian men often view sex as a performance, something to perfect, to talk about, even to judge publicly. Erotic skill isn't just private pleasure, it's part of one's reputation. And reputations are fragile currency here. A rumor about your exploits could help your social standing, or undo it completely. From the book Sex with Kings, we know this isn't unique to Athens. Royal courts across time have treated sexuality as strategy, leverage, or entertainment. But Athens differs in scale. Here, even ordinary citizens find their personal desires tangled up in civic identity. You sit on a stone bench as a group of actors rehearses lines from an upcoming comedy by Aristophanes. The script includes several crude jokes about a philosopher's excessive probing of youthful minds, and you realize it's aimed at a real figure in town, probably Socrates, possibly your neighbor. Sex in Athens, much like theater, walks a fine line between sacred and ridiculous, and while men's affairs are semi-public and often celebrated, women's sex lives are tightly policed, or at least whispered about with far more judgment. The public-private split isn't just architectural, it's gendered. In fact, one of the more fringe practices involved public exposure as punishment. A married woman caught cheating could, theoretically, be paraded through the agora, naked, shaved, and holding a radish in a very unfortunate way. Historians still argue whether this was actually done or just a cautionary tale cooked up by moralists. But either way, the message was clear. Sex, even its failures, was everyone's business. And yet, even among all this public visibility, there's room for intimacy, sometimes in the most unexpected places. Like in the quiet moment when an old potter adds a tiny tender gesture to a vase scene, or when a bored teenager scratches a name into a temple wall, maybe his crush, maybe his conquest. Sexuality in ancient Athens is both art and argument, worship and weapon. And it begins tonight, with you walking the marble streets as the sun disappears behind the Acropolis, wondering if that loud moan from 2 doors down was theatrical or genuine. Either way, someone's going to talk about it tomorrow. You wake the next morning on a thin, straw-stuffed mattress in a small Athenian home, and you're already eavesdropping. Not by choice. There's just no way to not hear what's going on in the house next door. Or for that matter, in your own. The walls are made of mud brick. The windows are unglassed, just wooden shutters. And the idea of privacy in a bedroom? That's a luxury you left back in the 21st century. Athenians don't build for silence. They build for airflow, for light, for proximity. A house is not a sanctuary. It's a center of circulation. Relatives come and go, neighbors lean in to borrow wine or gossip, and your home life is a shared performance, constantly observed by others. So now you're sitting in a modest courtyard, trying to enjoy some barley bread and diluted wine, while a man in the neighboring home explains, loudly, why his wife won't sleep with him until he stops gambling. His mother-in-law chimes in, his dog barks, and someone, somewhere, is practicing flute scales with the rhythm of a malfunctioning metronome. Sex in ancient Athens, you're starting to realize, wasn't hidden behind closed doors because the doors were barely attached. What's more, even the structure of the Athenian home discouraged romantic seclusion. Most houses shared walls. Bedrooms opened directly into communal areas. Extended families lived together. Parents, kids, cousins, sometimes slaves or servants, and often with only a few rooms between them. You might be making love while 2 teenage nephews argued about figs in the next room. Romantic? Maybe not. Authentic? Absolutely. And let's talk about those rooms for a second. There's no master bedroom, no ensuite bathroom, maybe a small wooden bed frame, a chamber pot, a wall niche for a lamp. That's about it. Linen sheets? Forget it. If you're lucky, you've got a woven blanket that doesn't itch. So Athenians got creative. Love affairs happened wherever they could. On rooftops under the stars, in storerooms between amphorae of olive oil, in alleyways at dusk. It was part necessity, part drama, and entirely normal. In The Erotic Spirit Through History, Peter Webb writes about how architecture shapes desire. And nowhere is this clearer than Athens. The lack of privacy didn't stop sexual expression. It redirected it, made it more theatrical, more reactive, and strangely, more accepted. In fact, one of the most famous anecdotes in Athenian lore is about Alcibiades. You remember, Mr. Too Handsome for his own good, storming into the house of his friend Socrates in the middle of the night, drunk and determined to seduce him. According to Plato, Socrates refused him with philosophical dignity, though possibly an awkward cough or two, and they lay side by side in the narrow sleeping space, chastely arguing about virtue until dawn. The moment became legendary, not just for its flirtation, but because everyone heard about it. And that's the point. Their intimacy, or lack thereof, became public property, gossiped about, laughed over, and used as a character reference in later years. Was it romantic? No. Was it instructive? Maybe. Was it private? Absolutely not. Even ordinary citizens could find their love lives on public display, sometimes literally. Clay tablets with erotic poetry were common tokens exchanged between lovers, and more than one affair was betrayed by an accidentally discarded verse. One man's attempt at seductive verse, "Your eyes outshine Apollo's torch, and your thighs trap me like a net," was found scrawled on a cellar wall decades later. It was unclear whether the recipient was flattered or terrified. And then there's the architecture of shame. If a man was caught in adultery, he could be legally beaten by the wronged husband or sued. But if a woman cheated, her father might sell her or exile her altogether. Historians still argue whether these punishments were consistently enforced or more bark than bite, but the threat lingered, loud, echoing through those thin walls. Still, public sexual culture wasn't all shame and surveillance. There was also comedy. Imagine listening through the wall as your neighbor acts out a scene from Aristophanes, where a woman refuses sex until her husband ends the war, a political protest played out as bedroom banter. Laughter in Athens is a tool, and sex is one of its favorite punchlines. From your courtyard perch, you overhear a merchant describe how he's building a sex room behind his olive press. For guests, he says, of course. It'll have thick curtains and soft rugs, a sign of indulgence, almost scandalous in its attempt to create privacy. Everyone chuckles. No one believes him. In time, you come to accept that your romantic life, should you dare to have one, is as much a part of your public identity as your sandals or your stammer. And when night falls again, and you stretch out under the stars, you hear it all happening around you. A quiet giggle behind a wall, a whispered name, a slap, a sigh, a door creaking open, and not quite shut. It's not intrusive, not really. It's the sound of a city living, breathing, loving, and never quite shutting up about it. You're reclining now, not in a bed, but in the flickering half-light of a symposium, Athens' most infamous social ritual. Imagine a mix between a dinner party, a TED Talk, and a slightly unhinged fraternity reunion, all soaked in diluted wine and unapologetic philosophical tangents. The kind of night where you're either being seduced, insulted, or educated, often all at once. Tonight's host is Dion, a cheerful merchant who's clearly had a successful quarter, judging by the imported figs and the unnervingly large statue of Priapus by the wine jug. He's fat, funny, and extremely loud. You're not sure whether you're meant to admire him or feel vaguely threatened. Welcome to the Athenian Symposium. These gatherings are technically invitation only, male only, and rule flexible. The only women present are hetairae, professional courtesans who can debate Euripides, recite Homer backwards, and pour wine without spilling a drop, even while side-eyeing a guest's sandal choice. Their laughter is real, sharp-edged, and practiced. These aren't concubines. They're entertainers, philosophers, artists of the social realm. You sip your cup, 4 parts water to 1 part wine as tradition demands, and try to follow the conversation. It's a chaotic swirl of flirting, mock debates, limericks about goats, and one fairly heated argument about whether Achilles was in love with Patroclus or just deeply bras. Spoiler, everyone agrees it was love, except that one guy in the corner who insists it was a metaphor for courage. He gets wine spilled on his lap. Here's where it gets especially Athenian. While these gatherings are soaked in sensual energy, they aren't orgies. They're not about anonymous indulgence. They're about public performance of desire. It's less what you do than how you talk about it. Less physical than theatrical. Every compliment, wink, and double entendre is layered with social nuance and competitive bravado. One of the hetairae, a flute player named Cleo, has just finished a poem so spicy it might violate at least 2 Spartan laws. The men laugh, and one demands she repeat the line about the liar that knows no shame. She does, slower this time, and with a smirk that could launch 1,000 triremes. Then Dion calls for everyone's favorite drinking game. Guess the lover. Each guest has to describe a romantic partner using only metaphor, and everyone else guesses who it is. You watch in awe as a younger guest blushes furiously when someone correctly guesses his slippery mountain goat who conquered my ridges. Subtle? No. Entertaining? Absolutely. In the center of this elaborate ritual is one of Athens' most complicated institutions, pederasty. Today, we view this dynamic with the discomfort it rightly deserves, older men pursuing teenage boys under the guise of mentorship. But to Athenians, this was seen, by many, not all, as educational, aspirational, even noble. These relationships followed an expected choreography. The Erastes, adult male, pursued, courted, and mentored the Eromenos, youth, who was expected to be both modestly resistant and charmingly available. Think of it as emotional fencing with social capital on the line. You sit between 2 such pairs tonight. One older gentleman brags that his Eromenos just won a poetry contest and has thighs like Corinthian columns. The youth, possibly 14, grins awkwardly while pushing grapes around his plate. Was it all physical? Not always. Some scholars argue many of these pairings were chaste, a kind of idealized love that emphasized virtue and loyalty. Others insist they were deeply erotic, if not outright sexual. The truth is messy. Historians still argue whether most of these relationships were mentoring in disguise or predatory custom with a philosophical cover. Michel Foucault, in The History of Sexuality, writes that Greek sexuality wasn't about who you loved, but how you loved them. Were you dominant, passive, clever, embarrassing? That was the axis of judgment, not gender. It wasn't considered homosexuality or heterosexuality. There was no such binary yet, only roles and reputation. Reputation was everything. You could lose your political career over a badly timed flirtation. You could gain allies by quoting Sappho in the right voice at the right moment. One wrongly worded joke at a symposium might follow you to court years later. Athenians had long memories and even longer grudges. And then there's the curious presence of the hetairai, neither wives nor prostitutes, but something stranger and more powerful. These women weren't hidden like wives were. They were visible, outspoken, educated. They could own property, attend symposia, and influence powerful men. Some even hosted salons of their own. A story from Sex with Kings tells of an Athenian hetaira who outwitted a foreign diplomat during a symposium, using wordplay so suggestive and brilliant that he rewrote his entire speech out of embarrassment. She wasn't punished, she was praised. In a city where wives were expected to stay silent and unseen, these women were lightning in a bottle. Back at Dion's symposium, the party is winding down. The flute girl is asleep against a column. Two philosophers are arguing softly over whether love originates in the spleen, and someone is softly singing a hymn to Eros, the god of desire. It's surprisingly sweet. You step out into the early morning air, cheeks warm from wine and proximity. You haven't kissed anyone, but somehow you feel like you've participated in something deeply intimate, something more revealing than any physical act could have been. Sex in ancient Athens wasn't behind closed doors. It was on couches, in stories, under lamplight, across glances. It was discussed, laughed about, judged, and sometimes worshipped. It was as public as the sunlit streets, as complicated as the city's laws, and as performative as the plays echoing through the theater of Dionysus. And now, with wine in your belly, and a scandalous pun still echoing in your ears, you wander home through quiet streets lit only by moonlight and a faint smell of roasting barley. You wake late the next day to the usual chaos, a donkey braying somewhere, a child shouting about sandals, and someone, perhaps Dion again, loudly regretting his symposium performance. But today, you're not wandering into a party. You're about to step into the backbone of Athenian sexual identity, the all-male love economy. In Athens, desire among men wasn't just tolerated, it was an institutionalized part of life. Not a lifestyle, not a scandal, but a framework. An entire social scaffold built on flirtation, mentorship, and the constant negotiation of reputation. To be admired by an older man was almost a rite of passage. To attract that admiration without inviting gossip, an art form. You cross the agora where two young men are mock wrestling, all limbs and laughter. Around them, older men lounge on benches pretending to ignore it, but their eyes are definitely watching. Here in Athens, youth is both currency and spectacle. A well-shaped calf, a clever comeback, even the way a boy ties his himation, these are social cues. Signals, invitations maybe, or armor. The relationship between Erastus, the pursuer, and Eromenos, the beloved, is everywhere. Painted on vases, carved into stone, whispered in poetry, written in graffiti like, "The boy from Kerameikos has stolen my sleep and my wine," which some poor merchant probably wrote after being ghosted before ghosting had a name. But this isn't a city of romantic ideals. It's a city of rules. The Erastes must court with gifts, nothing vulgar ideally, a caged bird, a rare fig, a poem that rhymes at least most of the time. The Eromenos must be modest, withholding, but not rude. If he gives in too quickly, he's mocked. If he refuses too long, he's accused of arrogance. Historians still argue whether these relationships were ever equal. On paper, they're based on education, protection, and guidance. But dig a little deeper, and the power imbalance becomes hard to ignore. Some boys gained powerful patrons and careers. Others were left behind, just another body in someone else's story. You pause by a pottery seller's stall. On a shallow bowl, you see a familiar scene. A bearded man offering a rooster to a boy who looks half bored and half amused. It's a standard courtship gift. The artist has added a sly detail. The rooster's tail is absurdly feathery, almost flirtatiously so. Even the pottery is in on the joke. But the most fascinating thing, these relationships weren't considered gay. Athens didn't divide the world into straight and not straight. Desire wasn't categorized by gender, but by status. If you were the active partner, the one who initiated, taught, dominated, you were behaving properly, regardless of your lover's body. If you were passive, especially as an adult, now that could cause scandal. And yet, some relationships did evolve beyond mentorship into genuine affection. There's the story of Harmodius and Aristogeiton, lovers turned political martyrs. When the tyrant Hipparchus tried to seduce Harmodius and was spurned, he retaliated by humiliating Harmodius's sister. The lovers, enraged, plotted and carried out an assassination. They failed, but they became symbols of resistance and of romantic devotion. Statues of them stood in the agora, right where you're standing now. One local mutters as he passes, "If only modern lovers had such bravery." You're not sure whether he's being serious or just hasn't recovered from last night's symposium. There's also the poetry, sweet, aching, and sometimes wildly inappropriate. A fragment preserved on papyrus reads, "I touched his shoulder and my knees betrayed me. His mouth held a son I dared not kiss." You imagine the writer scribbling in some dusty courtyard, hoping someone would find the lines and know the feeling. But not all was idyllic. When love turned sour, or when the younger man aged out of desirability, things could get cruel. A former Eromenos might be mocked for clinging to youthful affections or derided in comedies as effeminate. The same society that celebrated pederasty could be viciously fickle. There were also class dynamics at play. Not every boy was courted out of admiration. Some were slaves. Some were too poor to say no. The line between affection and exploitation was blurry and not always acknowledged. Even philosophers weighed in. Plato, in his Symposium, imagines a world where souls once had 2 heads and 4 arms and were split by the gods, forever seeking their other half. A poetic metaphor, sure, but underneath it, a hunger for connection that transcends social role and body. You sit beneath an olive tree and watch 2 young men practice throwing a discus. One pretends to fall just a bit too close to the other. There's laughter, a shove, a sudden stillness. It's not about the discus. And in that moment, you see what Athens did so well. It wove desire into everything, into sport, into mentorship, into politics, into storytelling. Sex wasn't tucked away behind curtains. It was part of education, of aspiration, of civic life. Tonight, you'll attend another symposium, maybe hear a new poem, maybe watch an older man fumble through a toast. But right now, you just sit in the shade, wondering what it would feel like to have every glance you exchange judged by half a city. It's exhausting, it's theatrical, it's undeniably intimate, and it's absolutely public. You wake the next morning to a thin shaft of sun carving through the shutters. Somewhere outside, a rooster declares victory over dawn, and you, reluctantly, are awake again in a city where privacy isn't sacred. But Aphrodite absolutely is. Today, you're headed to see her, the goddess of love, beauty, desire, and let's be honest, occasional chaos. Aphrodite is everywhere in Athens. Her shrines stand tucked into street corners and courtyards. Her name is whispered in love songs and legal pleas, and her statues, well, let's just say they leave very little to the imagination. But this morning, you're going somewhere special. You're climbing the slope of the Acropolis, past slow-moving donkeys and priests in linen, to visit the temple of Aphrodite Pandemos, Aphrodite of the people. From her hilltop perch, she watches over all of Athens, goddess of desire, not just divine or noble, but public, earthy, democratic in a way. Everyone, from slave to senator, prays to her. Not for abstinence, mind you, but for success in love, fertility, seduction, or possibly just not getting dumped during festival season. Inside the temple, the air smells of burnt resin and crushed rose petals. The priestesses are humming, looping garlands around her marble feet. There's no altar of shame here. Offerings include mirrors, perfumes, poems, tokens of longing more than repentance. One man leaves a tiny sandal with a note carved into the sole. "She walks in my dreams." It's corny, but kind of perfect. You find yourself lingering beside a wall carved with erotic graffiti, likely made by pilgrims. Some messages are crude, some heartbreakingly sweet. One reads, "I touched her hand during the dance. May Aphrodite remember." Another, scrawled in clumsy letters, "He looked back." Aphrodite's worship blurs the line between spiritual and sensual. You don't just ask her to help you find love. You ask her to guide your hands, smooth your words, make your sweat smell like honey. She's a full-service deity. But her temples weren't just places for hopeful lovers. They were deeply woven into civic life. On festivals like Aphrodisia, Athenians paraded through the streets singing songs that could make even seasoned hetairai blush. The entire city, judges, teachers, bakers, celebrated love with wine, poetry, and occasionally some fairly unbuttoned theatrics. And it wasn't just Aphrodite. You see, in Athens, gods didn't shy away from erotic complexity. They embraced it. Eros, god of desire, was both a playful nudge and an unstoppable force. Dionysus blurred the lines of gender and identity altogether. His festivals were raucous, gender-fluid, and full of ecstatic abandon. People danced in masks, shed clothes and roles, and let go of everything they were supposed to be. Even Artemis, virgin goddess of the hunt, had temples decorated with secret offerings from women praying for fertility and possibly good timing. But Aphrodite remains the queen of public love. From the erotic spirit through history, Peter Webb notes that her worship often invited, not repressed, desire. Ancient love wasn't about concealment, but confrontation. You faced your craving. You sang about it. You painted it on vases. You asked the gods to make it worse, just to feel it more fully. Some scholars still debate whether sacred prostitution existed in her temples. Herodotus insisted that in some regions, women offered themselves once to a stranger in her honor. Others argue it's a mistranslation, a moral projection by later authors. Historians still argue whether these rituals were real, symbolic, or invented by Roman tourists looking for spicy travel stories. But even if no coins changed hands, the idea that desire had divine blessing was powerful. There was no wall between sacred and sensual here, no clear line between altar and embrace. In fact, a fringe tradition involved writing your lover's name on a small votive and burying it beneath the temple steps, asking Aphrodite to bind their heart to yours. You pass a few young women doing exactly that now, giggling nervously, clutching tiny clay hearts like they're holding secrets wrapped in prayers. Even public statues weren't shy. You pass a courtyard bust of Eros that's been rubbed smooth at the thighs and lips from centuries of hopeful caresses. He grins eternally, arms outstretched, flirtatious, slightly smug. And it wasn't just the temples that honored love. Every home had a small household altar, often with a painted image of Aphrodite tucked among the jars of grain and kitchen gods. Every marriage bed was, symbolically, her territory. Every sigh after a kiss, a quiet invocation of her name. There's even a marketplace rumor about a baker who claimed Aphrodite helped him perfect his honey cakes after a steamy dream involving her and a rather explicit lemon metaphor. His cakes are excellent. His dreams remain suspiciously vivid. So now, as you leave the temple, the sun sliding down the marble columns, you find yourself changed. Not from belief necessarily, but from immersion. You've stepped into a city where love is not hidden, where the divine listens to pillow talk, watches crushes unfold in courtyards, and maybe, just maybe, laughs along. In modern life, we hide our feelings behind screens, behind emojis, and overthinking. But here in ancient Athens, if your heart stirs, you light a lamp. You write a name, you make an offering, and you let the whole street hear you sing. Because in the city of Athena, even love wears a chiton and walks proudly in the sun. You're walking now through a shaded side street, the midday heat curling off the stones in waves. And you're thinking naturally about women, or more precisely, how Athens thought about women and where they fit in this tangled web of public sex, private desire, and very performative relationships. Spoiler, it's complicated, and not particularly fair. In public life, Athenian women are nearly invisible. They don't vote, they don't attend symposiums, they can't argue in court. If their names appear in political records, it's usually because something scandalous happened. And yet, in the private realm, the real Athens, the homes, the bedrooms, the whispered jokes, women are everywhere. Respected, desired, feared, controlled, adored. Their sexuality is both sacred and suspicious. You duck through the outer gate of a modest home in the Kolonos district. Inside the andron, the male domain, is airy, tiled, meant for guests. But upstairs, through a narrow stairwell, is the Gneikonidis, the women's quarters. Here's where the story gets quiet and interesting. The Gneikonidis is dim, orderly, and tightly managed. This is where wives weave wool, tend children, manage slaves, and in many cases spend the majority of their lives. Most Athenian women leave the house only for festivals, funerals, or market trips, And even then, they're often veiled or accompanied. Yet inside these walls, power simmers. Wives keep households running. They oversee food stores, finances, and family rituals. They are not passive, they're essential. But they're also watched. A man's reputation hinges on the modesty of his wife. A woman caught being too visible, laughing with a stranger, speaking too boldly, risks shame not just for herself, but for her entire household. There's a reason those walls are so thick. But here's the kicker. While respectable wives are kept hidden, hetarai, the educated courtesans, move freely. They attend symposiums, they quote Euripides, they argue with philosophers, they flirt in public, they're celebrities. It's a wild, inverted hierarchy. You pass one now, at a corner near the theater, surrounded by admirers. Her name is Thais. She has eyes like storm clouds and a voice like olives dipped in wine. She's reciting lines from a play she once performed in, a comedic take on the myth of Leda and the swan. Half the crowd is blushing. The other half is pretending not to. She catches you watching and winks. You almost trip over a basket of figs. Thais, like many hetarai, was likely trained from a young age in music, rhetoric, and seduction. She isn't a wife. She's not expected to be chaste. She's not hidden away. And because of that, she occupies a bizarre but powerful space. Desired by men, resented by some women, and admired, albeit quietly, by many. And then there are the pornai, a word that gives us the modern term, but meant something more transactional. These were women, often enslaved, who worked in public brothels or the streets near the port of Piraeus. Their lives were harder, more dangerous, and deeply precarious. Yet even here, sex remains public. Brothels were marked with signs. Prices were standard. One brothel supposedly had a mechanical device, a kind of ancient coin-operated turnstile for quick encounters. Think of it as the fast food of Athenian love. You pay, you enter, you leave with questionable pride and fewer drachmas. Solon, one of Athens' great lawmakers, supposedly legalized and even standardized prostitution to protect men from falling into inappropriate liaisons with noble families. A noble intention, if wildly patriarchal. Historians still debate whether this was fact or fable, or just a clever cover story for a thriving industry. Either way, the result was clear. Women's sexuality was managed. Wives were cloistered, hetarai celebrated, pornai taxed, but none were truly free. Their bodies were either someone's honor, someone's pleasure, or someone's revenue. You enter a small pottery shop and see a new batch of Kylix cups lined up for sale. One shows a symposium scene, a woman playing the lyre while men cheer. Another shows a wife weaving at home, her face carefully blank. The contrast couldn't be clearer. One is performance, the other, duty. From Sex with Kings, we know this duality isn't unique to Athens. Across empires, the woman in the public eye is scrutinized while the woman behind the veil is idealized and sometimes forgotten. But in Athens, it becomes structural, a coded language in architecture, poetry, and law. One more fragment you overhear, passing a group of teenage girls practicing a festival chant, the quiet voice rules the house. A warning? A proverb? Maybe both. Yet, despite all this control, love still finds a way. There are stories of noble women exchanging letters with poets, of quiet affairs that begin at wells beneath olive trees behind a glance. Even in a society this rigid, the human heart, it insists on slipping through the cracks. Tonight, you'll lie awake again, and through the wall you'll hear laughter, maybe ties with a client, maybe a wife telling a story to her child. Both are lives. Both are true. And both are part of the strange, layered fabric of this city, where women are both absent from history and pulsing just beneath every line of it. You're standing in the middle of the agora now, squinting against the bright sun as merchants argue over fig prices and philosophers loudly lose track of their own metaphors. It's noisy, colorful, chaotic, and maybe a little arousing if you're into sandal straps and logic puzzles. But here's what really grabs your attention. Everyone seems to be talking about someone else's love life. That man over there with the fish cart? He's whispering about how his cousin's wife got caught sneaking out during Thargelia. The old woman with the leeks? She's loudly recounting how a merchant's son ran off with a flute girl and left behind an entire wedding feast. Athens has laws, many of them. But when it comes to sex, those laws are less about protection and more about reputation control. In other words, you can do what you want if you're careful, discreet, and male. And even then, it depends on your status. Let's say you're a citizen. You can sleep with your wife, obviously, your concubine, fine, a hetairai, sure, and even with pornai, no one's shocked. But if you seduce another man's wife, suddenly you're in court, or worse, being beaten by her relatives with sticks and a very specific sense of civic pride. It's not about morality, it's about property, honor, and most of all, citizenship. Athenian women are seen as vessels for lineage. If another man impregnates your wife, it doesn't just bruise your ego, it threatens your entire bloodline, your political legacy, your family inheritance. So the law says, if you catch a man in bed with your wife, you may kill him on the spot, and the courts will nod solemnly and say, sounds fair. But wait, it gets weirder. If your wife cheats with someone not a citizen, say a foreign merchant or a slave, the punishment might be lighter. Why? Because the risk to lineage is lower. Still humiliating, but politically less catastrophic. There are also loopholes, glorious, greasy little legal passages people slide through like eels in olive oil. For example, there's a law against men prostituting themselves for money. But does it count if it's a gift? If the man is young and charming? If the giver is subtle? Historians still argue whether certain erotic relationships were technically illegal or just vaguely frowned upon with wine-stained smirks. Then there's the dokimasia, a civic review process where officials were examined to make sure they hadn't done anything dishonorable. And yes, that includes sleeping with the wrong people in the wrong context. If someone accused you of being too soft, too submissive, too sexually available, you could lose your position in government. This was no idle threat. One case involved a man named Timarchus, a promising citizen who was publicly accused of having sold his body as a youth. That was enough. Not only did he lose his civic rights, he became a cautionary tale. Don't be too pretty, too eager, or too fond of expensive sandals. People will talk. And in Athens, talk becomes law. You take a break under an awning where two old men are debating whether Pericles was too emotionally attached to his mistress, Aspasia. One insists she whispered policy into his ear between kisses. The other claims she simply had excellent wine. You sip from your own cup, pretend not to eavesdrop, and marvel at how personal politics are here. From Sex with Kings, Eleanor Herman reminds us that rulers everywhere use sex as power. But in Athens, even the non-rulers are part of this game. Your bedroom choices ripple outward through your oikos household, your demi neighborhood, your city. You are never sleeping alone, even when you are. The courts take this so seriously that you could sue someone not for sleeping with your wife, but for seducing her. The difference? Seduction implied emotion. An emotional betrayal was far worse than a mere physical affair. After all, lust fades. But falling in love with someone else's spouse? That's a political problem. Ironically, rape, while deeply damaging, was treated as less threatening to the husband's honor because it didn't suggest the wife's consent. It's a brutal hierarchy of values, and scholars continue to wrestle with how Athenian society could be so thoughtful about philosophy and so callous in law. And yet, through all these tangled statutes, there's a kind of back-alley honesty. Everyone knows the rules, the risks, and the rhetoric. Sex is power. Power is status. Status is everything. So people watch. They whisper. They drop hints. A too lingering glance at a festival? Noted. A suspicious friendship with a young actor? People are already composing poems. You step into a courtroom now, not as a defendant, but an observer. It's packed, noisy, buzzing with the thrill of scandal. Today's case, a citizen accuses another of corrupting a free boy. The defendant denies everything, but the prosecutor reads aloud from a letter allegedly found under a mattress. It's flowery, a little desperate, and ends with, "I cannot sleep when your curls haunt my thoughts." The crowd gasps. A woman in the back fans herself dramatically. The defendant blushes. The judge raises an eyebrow and the trial continues. You slip out before the verdict. But the message is clear. In Athens, your desires follow you everywhere. Into the courts, the markets, the voting booths. There's no such thing as just a relationship. Every kiss is political. Every glance is a gamble. Tonight, as the city cools under the stars, you'll hear the voices drifting through open shutters, arguing, laughing, whispering. You'll wonder what secrets are being bargained, what loopholes exploited, what laws are quietly bent, and you'll realize in a city this obsessed with sex, Even the rules are flirtatious. You stroll the agora once more, dodging baskets of olives and flocks of chickens, headed toward a small square where the scent of grilled onions and sea-brined fish hangs in the air like a promise. But today you're not shopping, you're people watching. Because in Athens, the marketplace isn't just where you buy wine or argue about lentils. It's where seduction unfolds in public, petty revenge is whispered over cheese, and every casual flirtation risks becoming the talk of the town. The Athenian agora is noisy, crowded, full of elbows and innuendo. You watch as a handsome man flirts with a perfume vendor, leaning across the counter just a bit too far, picking up scent jars and murmuring, "This reminds me of you." She rolls her eyes, but doesn't hand the jar back. Nearby, a fishmonger glares at his apprentice, muttering that he spends more time eyeing couriers than scaling mullet. And beside the olive press, two men sit on a bench, not quite touching, arguing softly about the best place to spot pretty boys in the gymnasium. The answer, apparently, is anywhere near the wrestling mats. It's not that Athenians are especially flirty, it's that they're performative. There is no word for TMI in classical Greek. If you blush easily, this is not your city. In fact, the agora itself is a kind of erotic stage. Public affection is rare, but public tension? Deliciously common. That slow glance, the way someone adjusts their himation just as another walks by, a dropped fig, a suggestive proverb, it's foreplay via olives. You stop at a stall selling miniature ceramic gods and notice one labeled Aphrodite's merchant charm. The vendor grins, helps with sales and seductions. You don't buy it, but you do blush. He notices. There's a myth, probably exaggerated, that Socrates once met his wife Xanthippe in the agora. She was yelling at a vendor. He admired her fire. They married. She later dumped a chamber pot on his head during an argument. Historians still argue whether the story is literal or allegorical, but it fits the vibe. Athens is where passion meets public space with very little warning. And speaking of warnings, don't forget the rumors. Athenians love gossip the way bakers love flour. It gets into everything. A man is spotted walking too slowly past a certain fig seller's stall. Clearly he's hoping to catch her eye, or her husband's absence. A young widow is seen laughing with her neighbor. Clearly she's planning a secret wedding or a scandal. Some men hire talkers, street performers or public criers, to subtly circulate stories about their conquests. Oh, didn't you hear? Damon spent the night with that flute girl from the temple steps, said she had the voice of a muse and the hips of a Spartan shield. You're not sure how that's anatomically possible, but the story spreads. Even buying certain things becomes erotic. Figs, for instance, are famously suggestive, not just because of their shape, which, come on, but because fig trees were sacred to Dionysus and associated with fertility. A man giving a woman figs in the agora might be sending more than just groceries. From the erotic spirit through history, Peter Webb notes how markets in ancient societies doubled as spaces of social performance, especially in erotic terms. Where better to show off your wealth, taste, and availability than while holding a particularly sensual melon? One fringe custom you overhear while eavesdropping near a basket weaver stall involves writing flirtatious riddles on parchment and slipping them into fruit bundles. Who brings sweetness and seeds to my doorstep, yet vanishes before dawn? A riddle and a pickup line. It's efficient. And then there are the barbershops. Oh yes, Athenian barbershops aren't just about trimming your beard or waxing your arms. They're gossip cauldrons, where political rumors and romantic scandals get stirred until boiling. You walk past one now and catch a snatch of conversation. She said she was praying to Artemis, but I saw him leave her house at moonrise. The barber doesn't even blink, just nods, plucks a gray hair from a client's brow and says, Aphrodite works nights. But the agora is also a place where sexual economics play out in full view. Hetairae stroll the edges, offering glances that are half invitation, half challenge. Some leave tokens, silk scarves, pressed flowers, in spots where potential clients will find them. And not just any clients. Educated, witty, preferably well-oiled, and slightly tragic men. Tragic is very in right now. Meanwhile, porni linger near the fringes of the market, sometimes clustered near bathhouses or wine shops. They're more direct, less poetry, more transaction. One leans against a pillar and shouts, "You look like you need both advice and a nap. I offer both." You're oddly tempted. And yes, women shop here too, especially wealthier wives accompanied by servants. While they appear demure, they're not deaf. They hear everything. They might even smirk when a street poet recites verses about thighs and moonlight. They just do it behind fans or under veils. There's even a popular street game, Who's Lover, where people describe a well-known citizen in scandalous terms, and others guess their paramour. Wears red sandals, likes figs, disappears on feast days. A young boy nearby guesses correctly and is given a date pastry as a prize. And you, innocent visitor, have become part of the market's rhythm. You pause at a stall, reach for a pomegranate, and a girl beside you murmurs, "Careful, it's a love fruit." You freeze. She grins. Then she's gone, leaving you holding the fruit like a confession. That night, as the market shutters close and the city grows quiet, you realize something. The Agora is not just a marketplace. It's a flirtation arena, a rumor engine, a romantic comedy stage set under marble porticos. People don't just buy bread here, they broadcast themselves. And tomorrow, someone will be whispering about you. The sun hangs high over Athens, and today you're following one of the city's most tantalizing rumors. It drifts like incense through every colonnade and clings to the lips of wine merchants and gossiping midwives. That in certain sacred temples, priestesses once offered more than prayers. They offered their bodies. It's the tale of sacred prostitution, a phrase equal parts reverent and scandalous. You've probably heard it whispered in a documentary or wedged into a travel podcast, that in the temples of Aphrodite, particularly in the high places, women united with strangers in acts of ritual intimacy, all in honor of the goddess of love. But did it really happen? That's the first mystery. Even now, historians still argue whether sacred prostitution was ever truly practiced in Athens. Herodotus, our favorite ancient travel blogger with a flair for drama, claimed such rites took place, especially in cities like Corinth and Babylon. He wrote that every woman, once in her life, had to sit at the temple and couple with a stranger who tossed a coin into her lap, dedicating the act to the goddess. His version made for thrilling reading. But modern scholars, they're more skeptical. Many suggest Herodotus might have misunderstood foreign customs, misinterpreted local metaphors, or, let's be honest, gotten a bit carried away with the drama. No actual Athenian legal code confirms such practices in the city, and no clear archaeological evidence supports the story. Still, the myth lingered. And that might be even more telling, because myth in Athens often blurs beautifully with memory. So while there may not have been temple-sanctioned trysts written into official law, the idea of sacred desire was very real and very present in daily life. This morning you climb the winding path toward the temple of Aphrodite Pandemos, perched on the southern slope of the Acropolis. It's not the grandest temple, but it's intimate, shaded by olive trees, perfumed by thyme and laurel. Here she's not just the goddess of love, she's the goddess of everybody's love. Love of the people, lust of the streets, flirtation of the market, whispered names, and shared figs. The priestesses here don't wear crowns or shimmer in gold. They walk softly, dressed in simple linen, stringing flowers through each other's braids. A few are older, most are serene. They greet you not as an outsider, but as someone arriving late to a very old conversation. You spot the statue of the goddess, curvaceous, hand outstretched, with eyes that seem to follow you just enough to be flattering. There's no fire and brimstone sermon here, no heavy incense clouding the air, just a gentle humming from a side alcove where two women sing an old love hymn, slow, circular, like waves lapping at your ankles. At the base of the statue, offerings pile up like quiet secrets, carved tokens, dyed cloth, perfumed oil in tiny jars, dried rose petals wrapped in letters. Some of the notes are folded tight, others flutter open. One reads, "Let him look back." Another, written in careful, almost childlike lettering, "Give me what he gave her." Even in silence, the temple speaks. You ask a local vendor nearby if the priestesses ever, He grins without looking up from his honey cakes and says, "They offer blessings. The rest is your own prayer." You're not sure that clears anything up. From the erotic spirit through history, Peter Webb notes that in many ancient cultures, love and religion weren't separate lanes. They overlapped like shadows at twilight. Sacred rituals often included sensuality, symbolic union, or fertility rites, And while formalized sacred prostitution in Athens may be more legend than law, the emotional truth behind it remains. Athenians believed love was divine, desire was powerful, and the body could be an offering, voluntarily or otherwise. Some fringe practices may have fed the myth. During certain festivals, like the Aphrodisia, young women would dance through the streets barefoot, veiled, scattering petals and singing songs older than democracy. Were they priestesses, citizens, courtesans? It's hard to say. The roles, much like their melodies, blurred beautifully. You even hear stories of women who would fast before visiting the temple, then sleep there overnight in hopes of dreaming about their future lovers. If they awoke with a name on their lips or a certain fragrance in their nose, they'd take it as a sign. This wasn't considered superstition. It was divine matchmaking. There's a small stone bench near the back of the temple courtyard. Locals call it Aphrodite's ear. Sit there, they say, and speak your longing. If the goddess is in a good mood, she'll send a sign within 3 days. You try it. Whisper something vague, non-committal. The next morning, a stranger smiles at you in the fig market. Coincidence? Probably. But you still blush. Historians often note how little physical evidence exists for these practices. No papyri with instructions, no receipts, no temple blueprints with bedroom chambers. But perhaps that's the point. Intimacy, especially sacred intimacy, wasn't recorded in ink. It was lived, sung, offered, and remembered. Besides, it's hard to imagine Athenians ever needing a rule book to blend the erotic with the divine. Even their architecture leans into it. The steps leading up to certain sanctuaries are deliberately narrow, forcing worshippers to walk close together, bodies brushing, breath shared. Coincidence? Maybe. Clever urban design with a hint of mischief? Definitely. From the history of sexuality, Foucault reminds us that ancient people didn't see the body as something to restrain, but to understand, refine, and sometimes, if the gods allowed, elevate. In Athens, love wasn't confined to beds or back rooms. It spilled into temples, poetry, law, and rumor. So maybe there weren't formal sacred prostitutes. But in a city where every corner held a statue of Aphrodite, and every whisper carried a name half pronounced, it didn't matter. The myth lived. The longing did too. And tonight, as you pass the temple again under starlight, you see a woman lighting a lamp beside the altar. She doesn't pray aloud. She just closes her eyes, holds the flame close to her chest, and smiles like someone who's just asked for something very particular. You're standing now inside a tiny, low-ceilinged workshop that smells like clay dust, wet paint, and a hint of yesterday's garlic. The shelves are crowded with pottery in all stages of undress, some still drying, some gleaming with black glaze, and others ready to shock anyone who wandered in looking for a fruit bowl. Welcome to the curious world of Athenian erotic pottery, where ancient Greeks left their dirty jokes, heartfelt wishes, and surprisingly detailed how-to scenes baked forever into ceramic. It's not hidden, it's not niche. In fact, some of the most explicit artwork Athens ever produced wasn't locked away in private collections. It was painted on the inside of wine cups. That's right, you're at a party, tipsy, swirling your drink, and bam, there's a fully illustrated position at the bottom of your cup. Surprise! The artist behind the kylix you're holding was not subtle. There's a man reclining, a flute girl smiling mysteriously, and a chicken wandering by for no apparent reason. Some scholars think the chicken's symbolic. Others think it was just Tuesday. Erotic scenes were especially common in the sympatic context, meaning pottery made for drinking parties, banquets, and sometimes educational purposes. It's hard to tell whether these pieces were meant to titillate, entertain, or instruct. Probably all three. The famous Pan painter and Brygos painter specialized in works that range from mythological mischief to what can only be described as ancient pinup art. You pass one now, Heracles, not wrestling a lion, but apparently very occupied with a nymphora of wine. Priorities. Athenian vases were like the memes of their day, funny, relatable, occasionally disturbing, and instantly recognizable. Imagine opening your kitchen cabinet to find a mug with a very detailed depiction of your neighbor and his cousin's flute teacher. That's what we're working with. Some images are affectionate. Lovers gaze at each other, touching hands, draped in fabric that's barely pretending to be clothing. Others are, frankly, athletic. A few have acrobatic feats that make you wonder what kind of diet these people were on. from sex with kings. Eleanor Herman notes how visual culture was used by rulers to shape image and desire. But in Athens, even non-rulers joined in. Pottery became a social mirror, reflecting what people did, what they dreamed of, what they joked about. And like all good comedy, it had layers. There are even instructional scenes, complete with labels like ancient IKEA manuals for intimacy, except with more emotional subtext. One amphora depicts two men reclining, one offering a lyre, the other holding a small tablet inscribed with a line of poetry. It's not just about sex, it's about connection. Desire, yes, but also recognition. You peer closer at a shelf of tiny oil lamps, their handles worn smooth from decades of use. Some are carved with symbols, the shell of Aphrodite, the rising wings of Eros, a knotted fig branch. One lamp, shaped like a reclining woman, glows faintly as a shop assistant lights it for a curious tourist. The flame flickers across her ceramic smile. She winks almost. And then you spot the graffiti. It's not on display. It's on the underside of a bowl, half hidden. Someone carved, "I kissed Leandros here, twice." That's it, just that. No flourish, no poetry. But it's tender. You imagine some apprentice potter sneaking back into the studio late at night, whispering the words as he etched them into clay still soft from the kiln. Athens, for all its formality and legalism, still made space for that kind of soft, human moment. You leave the workshop and step into a quiet alley near the Kerameikos district, the city's potter's quarter. The walls here are scratched with names and phrases, many barely legible now. You make out, "Ties dances like fire," and "He was a lion and I, his scarf." Strange, poetic, possibly a metaphor you don't understand, but that someone once felt very deeply. Historians still argue whether erotic pottery was consumed mainly by elites or if it trickled down to the masses. Some vases are so finely made, clearly destined for aristocratic homes. Others are crude, misshapen, funny in that my nephew painted this kind of way. What's clear is that Athenian society allowed, encouraged, even desired to be visual, shared, talked about. There are even examples of vases given as courtship gifts. Here, I got you this beautifully painted depiction of what I'd like us to do next Friday. Subtle? Not really. But effective? Who's to say? From the history of sexuality, Foucault reminds us that ancient cultures often used representation not to hide behavior, but to frame it, make it part of discourse, of ritual, of life. What's drawn is not always what's done, but what is dreamed, feared, admired. Athens, through its ceramics, leaves nothing to the imagination and everything to interpretation. Before you leave the Kerameikos, an old potter hands you a kylix. Not for drinking, he says, for remembering. You turn it over. Two figures, genderless, almost floating, embracing beneath a fig tree. No faces, just closeness. A tiny inscription curls along the rim. Desire is a guest with no sandals. You have no idea what it means, but it stays with you all the same. It's another warm night in Athens, and you found your way into a small courtyard illuminated by oil lamps. The marble is cool beneath your sandals, and the city hums gently, flute music drifting from a distant window, laughter echoing faintly off clay walls. It's peaceful, and then, without warning, someone launches into a myth, because of course they do. This is Athens. If you sit still for more than a few minutes, someone will inevitably start telling you a story involving a god, a goat, or a regrettable kiss. Tonight's tale begins, predictably, with Zeus, the man, well, god, who never met a transformation he didn't like. You've heard the greatest hits already: Leda and the Swan, Europa and the Bull, Danae and the Golden Rain. Yes, Golden Rain. Not subtle, not symbolic in the modest sense. The gods in Greek myth don't just break boundaries, they strut over them in sandals dipped in sass. Leda, for example, doesn't just meet a swan. She's seduced, or perhaps assaulted depending on the version, by Zeus in that very avian form. The encounter results in the birth of Helen of Troy, the face that would allegedly launch 1,000 ships and spark a war. That's a lot to unpack from one bird visit. But Zeus isn't alone in these divine escapades. Aphrodite seduces mortals. Poseidon turns into stallions. Dionysus tricks men and women alike into ecstatic trances that end in love, madness, or both. The gods behave like humans on their worst and occasionally best days, and humans in turn shape their own messy passions using these stories as scaffolding. Athenians told these myths not just to entertain, but to understand. Desire, confusion, betrayal, longing, these weren't just private emotions. They were divine forces, embodied by celestial beings who were just as dysfunctional as the potter 3 doors down, with a tendency to weep into his wine. Tonight, you're surrounded by locals reciting such stories with gleeful flair. One woman, hair braided with olive twigs, performs the tale of Hermaphroditus, the beautiful son of Hermes and Aphrodite, who, when embraced by the nymph Salmacis, is merged into one androgynous body, neither male nor female. Both. The gods don't apologize. They name it sacred. Complex? Yes. Controversial? Perhaps. But in Athens, gender wasn't always a fixed pillar. Sometimes it shimmered like the sea, always shifting. From the erotic spirit through history, Peter Webb notes that mythology was a safe container for taboo. Through myth, societies could explore everything from incest to same-sex desire to metaphysical longing without having to pass judgment. The myth speaks, the people nod, the lessons sink in like oil into linen. You wander toward the theater district as a crowd gathers to watch an impromptu performance, young men in masks acting out the myth of Narcissus, the boy who fell in love with his own reflection. It's equal parts tragedy and satire. In this version, Narcissus is mocked by a chorus of woodland creatures who keep shouting, "You're not that handsome!" The audience howls. Someone throws a fig. But the myth still lands. In a city where image matters, where how others see you defines your worth, Narcissus' story isn't just vanity. It's a cautionary tale. Look too long at yourself and you miss the touch of others. Fall too in love with your own legend and you forget how to be loved. Further down the street, you overhear a pair of elderly women debating whether the god Pan was more romantic or creepy. He followed that nymph for 3 days, one says. At least he played music, the other replies, shrugging. Consent remains a fuzzy issue in myth, even as laughter takes the edge off. And yet, for all their chaos, these stories aren't mocked. They're sacred. Your neighbor's affair may be whispered about with scandalized delight, but Zeus seducing a mortal, that's festival material. You sit near a fountain as someone begins reciting Sappho's verses under the stars. The air changes. Her words are soft, wrapped in longing, each line a thread tying heart to heart. He seems to me equal to the gods, that man who sits across from you. It's not about possession. It's about presence, about the ache of not being the one in her gaze. Sappho from Lesbos is quoted widely in Athens, though often in half tones. Her love poems to women are remembered with a kind of reverent ambiguity. Men steal her verses for their own seductions. Women memorize them in secret. No one says it aloud, but everyone knows. Her words tell truths that even the gods might envy. You begin to realize that myths in Athens don't live in books or temples. They live in gestures, jokes, glances. In the way a potter decorates a vase with Dionysus cradling a boy in a vine. In how a playwright adds a line to a tragedy just risque enough to make the elders shift in their seats. Dionysus, in particular, is a favorite here. God of wine, chaos, masks, and blurred identities. His festivals, the Dionysia, are moments when the city turns itself inside out. Men wear women's clothes. Women chant in forests. Roles melt away like wax. It's a purge, a ritualized rebellion against order. Once a year, Athens breathes wildness into its marble bones. Historians still argue whether these rites included full-on sexual rites or merely suggestive dances and songs. But again, in Athens, suggestion is often louder than certainty. A touch can be a sermon. A wink? A whole doctrine. Before heading home, you pass a small shrine where someone's left a bowl of honey and a single pomegranate. The scent is almost overpowering, sweet, decadent. A silent prayer to Aphrodite. Maybe someone's in love, maybe someone's been scorned, maybe both. And that's Athens in a mythic breath, strange, sensual, and utterly uninterested in hiding its stories. The gods don't behave, the people don't blush. They tell these tales not because they need answers, but because they need each other to nod and say, "Yes, I felt that too." You walk the quiet streets, torchlight flickering against marble columns, the myths swirling around you like perfume. Here, stories don't fade. They linger, just like desire. You wake to the distant clatter of sandals on marble and the low rumble of a very animated argument echoing from a public bathhouse 3 doors down. Someone is insisting that Socrates never bathed. Someone else claims he bathed too often, but only in olive oil and mischief. That's right. Today, you're going to follow the man, the myth, the walking thought experiment in a shaitan. Socrates. And this isn't the version they tell in philosophy classes. This is the real, slightly scandalous, possibly shirtless version, who managed to get himself into quite a bit of trouble, not for his teachings exactly, but for the rumors that clung to him like smoke. You stroll down a colonnade, and there he is. Socrates, not handsome, not wealthy, not particularly fragrant, but magnetic in the way only someone who asks far too many questions can be. He's barefoot, of course, standing in the agora with a small crowd of exasperated men and amused boys. He's mid-rant about how the body is a distraction from truth, while simultaneously sipping wine and smiling at a young man who looks like he just stepped out of a pottery painting. Athens has always had complicated feelings about Socrates. He claimed to know nothing, and yet everyone listened. He walked around asking people to define words they used every day: virtue, courage, justice. And when they couldn't, he just nodded and said, "Interesting." Then he'd do it again tomorrow. But underneath all that probing philosophy was something a little more suggestive. Because Socrates didn't just teach, he collected people, especially beautiful, clever young men. His most famous pupil, Alcibiades. Remember him? Political golden boy. A man so charming that entire cities were said to have betrayed each other just to be invited to his dinner parties. Alcibiades once accused Socrates publicly of seduction, or at least of confusing his young, wine-fogged heart. In Plato's Symposium, Alcibiades describes crawling into Socrates' bed naked, expecting romance, and being met with a polite refusal and a 3-hour conversation about virtue. No touching, just metaphysics. It's one of the great almost love stories of antiquity. Historians still argue whether Socrates was actually celibate, disinterested, or simply too busy constructing elaborate analogies to get around to anything physical. But what mattered wasn't what he did, it was how people talked about him. And oh, they talked. You stroll through a market stall and overhear someone muttering, "He corrupts the youth." Another adds, "He teaches boys to love boys more than their duties." A third, squinting over a papyrus, whispers, "I heard he said marriage was a form of self-inflicted exile." That last one might actually be true. You pass a wall etched with street poetry. A particularly cheeky one reads, "Socrates knows the truth, but keeps it under his toga." It's signed anonymous, but you know who. Athenians were deeply suspicious of those who blurred public and private. Socrates did it without blinking. He spoke of love, beauty, and desire in the same breath as ethics and politics. He walked through gymnasiums talking to sweaty teenagers about the soul. He refused payment. He ignored status. He questioned everything, which is probably why he ended up on trial. The charges were vague but loaded, corrupting the youth and impiety. But beneath them lurked unspoken accusations. Too many private conversations, too many rumors about what really happened during those philosophical strolls. Not enough respect for the city's boundaries, sexual, spiritual, or otherwise. You sit in the back of a reconstructed courtroom now, watching a reenactment of that famous trial. The prosecutor paints Socrates as a danger to the city's morals. He cites the behavior of his students, Alcibiades Critias, as evidence. He mentions the philosopher's habit of talking about divine voices that guided his choices. The implication? Madness, or something worse. And Socrates, calmly, with his famously smug expression, answers with questions. He doesn't deny the rumors, he simply sidesteps them, framing his life as a mission from the gods, to challenge, to question, to awaken. But the jury isn't entirely amused. There's a moment when someone yells, "Do you think you're better than the rest of us?" And Socrates replies, "I only know that I do not know." In another city, that might have been poetic. In Athens, it sounded dangerously like defiance. From the history of sexuality, Foucault writes that ancient societies often judged sexual conduct not by the act itself, but by its social ripple. Socrates, in that sense, was a tidal wave. His relationships, platonic or otherwise, disrupted norms, blurred roles, and raised uncomfortable questions about power, influence, and intimacy. In the end, the jury sentenced him to death by hemlock for talking too much, for loving the wrong way, for being public in private things and private in public things. You leave the courtroom in a daze, passing a mural of his last moments, sitting calmly, surrounded by students, reaching for the poison with no fear. Athens never quite recovered from killing Socrates. He became a symbol, a martyr to thought, a ghost that lingered in symposiums and whispered from painted pottery. Are you sure? How do you know you're sure? Even centuries later, people still ask, was Socrates in love with his students? Did he cross lines or merely tease them? Did he ever fall asleep mid-conversation and wake up mid-insult? The city never agreed. But one thing is certain. In a place where sex was public and philosophy even more so, Socrates blurred the boundary like no one else. And maybe that's why he had to go. You've been invited to the bathhouse. Now, before you get too excited, this isn't the candlelit Roman spa you might be picturing. The Athenian lutron is a far more humble affair. Think low stone basins, communal cold water splashing, and lots of half-dressed philosophers trying not to slip on olive oil tiles. But the baths are not just about getting clean. They are, as ever in Athens, about conversation. And yes, sometimes flirtation that steams more than the water. You step into the dim space, steam curling gently from clay amphorae of heated water, and you're immediately greeted by a burst of laughter from a group of young men oiling one another's shoulders with surprising efficiency. Two are arm wrestling, while a third provides commentary in verse form. A fourth lounges against the mosaic wall, eyes closed, reciting a love poem that may or may not be about the man he's sitting beside. Bathhouses in Athens are unisex in theory, but in practice they're mostly male-dominated. Women bathe at home, or occasionally in separate, smaller facilities. So in these public lutra, the male body is on full display, flexing, debating, sweating, and occasionally winking. One man offers you a handful of strigo, a curved metal scraper for removing sweat and oil. First time, he asks. You nod. He grins. Don't worry, everyone slips eventually. You're pretty sure he means that both literally and metaphorically. While Roman bathhouses had multiple rooms for hot, cold, and tepid water, Athenian ones are simpler, more functional. But don't be fooled, they're just as socially complex. Deals are made here. Affairs begin here. Gossip stews like barley in a pot. You settle onto a bench as someone launches into a story about a certain general's scandalous moonlight visit to a temple priestess. He claims he was there to pray, the storyteller says. But she was lighting candles in her bedroom, not incense in the atrium. The room erupts into knowing groans. From Sex with Kings, Eleanor Herman describes how bathing spaces across ancient cultures doubled as rumor factories. In Athens, the lutron is less about cleanliness than presentation. Your body is public here, but so is your reputation, which is why Athenian men were very careful with how they carried themselves in the bathhouse. Too modest? You might seem insecure. Too bold? You risked being called kinaidos, a word used to shame men seen as too passive, too feminine, or too forward in their affections. The trick, as always, was balance. You watch as one man compliments another's back muscles, then follows it with a philosophical quip about symmetry in nature. Everyone nods sagely. No one mentions that he's been sneaking glances since he walked in. And yes, there's touching. Of course there's touching. Oiling, scrubbing, helping someone rinse their hair. These are all technically hygienic acts. But in the right context, with the right tone, they can shift very quickly into something softer, more intimate. Historians still argue whether bathhouses were hotbeds of secret trysts or just heavy on flirtation. There's little written record of actual sex happening in the lutron, but the subtext is everywhere, especially in plays and comedy. Aristophanes, naturally, has several bathhouse scenes in his works where characters accidentally walk in on someone and then proceed to have a lengthy philosophical argument while entirely naked. One lesser-known comedic fragment even includes a man slipping on olive oil and landing face first in another's lap, leading to a mistaken marriage proposal and a 7-minute musical number. Okay, the musical part is debatable, but the Greeks loved a good chorus. And then there's the noise. You listen as a group of older men complain about the younger generation's obsession with hair removal. In my day, a man's chest hair was a symbol of honor, one says, combing his beard with a carved bone pick. Now they all want to be smooth as goddamn statues. Another man scoffs. Statues are gods. Maybe they're just trying to live up to the standard. They all nod reluctantly. Someone passes a fig. Bathhouses are also where politics and seduction blur most delightfully. One hetairai once famously recruited clients by accidentally dropping her towel while discussing tax reform. Another, a retired soldier turned poet, wrote a scandalous epic comparing different political factions to different bathwater temperatures. The Democrats were tepid, the oligarchs icy, and the radicals hot enough to scald. You admire the tile work near the pool. It shows Dionysus pouring wine over a group of satyrs dancing under a full moon, half drunk, half naked, fully delighted. The detail is exquisite. One satyr has his tongue sticking out. Another is clearly making eye contact with someone outside the frame. You think, this isn't just decoration. This is a message. The body isn't something to hide here. It's something to celebrate. The bathhouse, like the symposium, like the theater, like the agora, is a place where Athenian identity is shaped in public. Sometimes with words, sometimes with laughter, and sometimes with nothing more than a raised eyebrow during a particularly vigorous back scrub. As the evening cools and people begin to towel off and wander back into the streets, you linger for just a moment longer. There's something soothing in the routine. The splash of water, the scrape of the strigil, the low hum of teasing voices. You leave the lutron feeling both cleaner and somehow more tangled. Not in body, but in thought. Because in Athens, even a bath comes with layers. Ritual, flirtation, comedy, and the ever-present question, was that a joke or an invitation? Probably both. Dusk again. The city's pulse slows, but the shadows stretch longer, thicker, stranger. And tonight, you're headed somewhere even Athenian daylight doesn't entirely touch. The rites of Dionysus. Not the sanitized version, not the polite wine sips and fig leaf poetry. Tonight you follow the barefoot, veiled, ecstatic worshippers of a god who thrives on blurred lines between man and woman, self and other, order and glorious chaos. You begin in a grove just outside the city, olive trees twisting upward into a pink gold sky. There's drumming, low, rhythmic like a second heartbeat. You see flickers of movement, painted faces, animal masks, vines twisted into hair. No one speaks loudly. They don't need to. This isn't a public symposium. This is something older, deeper. A ritual, not of reason, but of release. Dionysus, god of wine, madness, fertility, and transformation, is worshipped through frenzy. His rites, known as Bacchanalia or Dionysia, depending on the form, were theatrical, emotional, sometimes unnerving, and deeply gender fluid. Tonight's ceremony is one of his private mysteries, invitation only, word of mouth. You're here because someone handed you a bunch of ivy and said, wear this, walk east, don't ask. Now you stand among Athenians who have shed their social selves like so much outer skin. Men wear women's robes, women chant in deep voices. Old farmers whisper prayers in languages even the priests don't fully recognize. A young man hands you a mask, wooden, painted, half smiling, half weeping. You put it on and immediately the world shifts. The edges blur. Someone grabs your hand, you're pulled into a slow, swaying dance. These rituals are full of contradiction. They're loud but hushed, intimate yet crowded, beautiful and slightly terrifying, just like Dionysus himself. He's the god who makes you forget your own name so you can remember something truer. You stumble slightly and someone steadies you, a tall figure, bare-chested, wearing a crown of pine. You lock eyes, and it's unclear who either of you are in this moment. Names, genders, desires, they all seem irrelevant. What matters is presence, being seen, being real. This is not about performance, not like the symposium or the agora. There, sex is a game. Here, it's a ritual, a way to dissolve the self. In the history of sexuality, Foucault points out how ancient rites allowed cultures to express forbidden desires through sanctioned forms. In these Dionysian rites, the rules are inverted. The respectable citizen becomes a servant of chaos. The rigid lines of identity, class, gender, status, melt under wine and moonlight. You hear a chant rise, winding like smoke. He comes, the god who smiles through tears. It's not rehearsed, but everyone knows it. They've sung it since childhood, in secret, when the adults weren't listening. Now, no one's pretending anymore. The ceremony builds. At its height, a woman in a lion-skin cloak steps into the center and begins to speak in a language you don't understand, but feel. Her voice cracks, soars, breaks open. People begin to cry. One man kneels. Another laughs uncontrollably. A young couple kisses like they just invented the concept. You're told later that the woman spoke in Dionysus' voice, that he chooses someone, each ritual, and speaks through them. No one ever remembers what was said, but everyone leaves changed. There's a story, probably apocryphal, that one year a prominent Athenian general attended the rite in secret, dressed as a woman. The next morning, he resigned from office and became a wandering bard. No one speaks of it directly, but when his name is mentioned in court, people glance at each other and smile. Another tale says a merchant once saw Dionysus himself during a rite, in the form of a vine-covered boy with eyes like mirrors. The merchant stopped selling goods, gave away his fortune, and opened a free wine house. When asked why, he simply said, "He smiled at me." Historians still argue whether these rites were about sex, ecstasy, or identity, or if separating those concepts misses the point entirely. Some believe orgies occurred. Others insist the physical was less important than the emotional undressing, the surrender of self. From the erotic spirit through history, Peter Webb notes how Dionysian worship provided an authorized inversion of normal behavior. You didn't break rules, you stepped outside them, temporarily, safely, cathartically. You walk back to the city in the quiet after the rite, shoes dangling from your hand, ivy crown askew. You don't feel drunk, but your skin hums. You remember someone's hand brushing your neck, a whisper, the smell of myrrh and figs. It doesn't feel like a secret. It feels like something too big for language. Back in town, the streets are silent, but on certain doorposts, you see pine cones hung gently from strings. Ivy reads, softly smudged footprints, little signs that someone else went walking with Dionysus tonight. You pass a boy on a rooftop, playing a reed pipe to no one in particular. He nods at you. You nod back. Nothing is said. Because some things, especially in Athens, aren't for daylight. They're for the mask, the moon, and the god who never judges what you become, only whether you dare to. The night after the Dionysian rite still clings to your skin. Fig juice on your fingers, dried wine on your sandals, and a thin layer of something less tangible. Awe, maybe. Or the leftover shimmer of transformation. But tonight, you're headed in a different direction. Not toward the frenzied chants of chaos, but toward a quiet voice that has whispered through the centuries, sometimes barely audible, but always there. Tonight, you follow the trail of Sappho. She never walked the streets of Athens herself, not as far as we know. She lived on the island of Lesbos, a sea-bound world away, surrounded by turquoise waters and groves of wild laurel. But her poems? Oh, they reached here. They slipped into symposiums, stowed themselves in wine cups tucked into scrolls, embroidered on the edges of linen. Her voice traveled far beyond her island, sometimes carried by lips that didn't dare admit who wrote the words. In Athens, they don't quite know what to do with her. On the one hand, she's a poet of remarkable skill, admired even by gruff old men in togas who generally preferred talking about geometry and warfare. Plato, yes, that Plato, called her the 10th muse. On the other hand, she wrote about women, desiring them, loving them, longing for them in ways that weren't coded, weren't theoretical, and definitely weren't academic. So what did Athens do? They quoted her, reverently, and then reinterpreted her, often. You ask one young Athenian scribe whether Sappho was a schoolmistress, a priestess, or a courtesan, and he shrugs, maybe all three, maybe none. She's not for explaining. Fair enough. Tonight you're heading to a private salon, less formal than a symposium, more intimate than a reading. A circle of hetairai and scholars gather in the upper room of a villa near the Knicks, oil lamps glowing softly, cushions spread on the mosaic floor. Someone passes wine, no flute music, just words. In the center, a courtesan named Dione begins to read. Her voice is low, clear, and slightly amused, as if she's reading letters not meant for public ears. He seems to me equal to the gods, that man who sits opposite you and listens close to your sweet speaking. The room stills. Everyone is looking at someone else, but trying not to make it obvious. You sip your wine and glance at the woman across from you, who's staring into the flickering oil flame with a soft expression that says, "I've been there." What's striking about Sappho's poetry isn't just her focus on women, but her focus, period. She writes about feelings, uncloaked, unapologetic, unrelenting, not big historical emotions, just the private, unbearable agony of watching someone you love talk to someone else. That's it. And yet, it burns. From the erotic spirit through history, Peter Webb argues that Sappho's genius lies in emotional immediacy. She doesn't describe relationships like epic events. She captures micro moments. The flutter in your throat, the ache in your ribs, the dizziness that comes from seeing a smile not meant for you. Athenians, who pride themselves on logos, reason, debate, witty one-liners, don't quite know how to handle this kind of emotional exposure. So they do what humans always do with things that make them uncomfortable. They pretend it's about something else. In the Agora earlier today, you heard a merchant quoting Sappho while haggling over a fish. Even in pain, I would choose you again. His customer laughed. But there was a moment, just a flicker, where you saw the real weight of the line. Even the philosophers quote her, though they often change the subject quickly. Aristotle once referenced her metaphor of love as fire under the skin, then immediately launched into a disquisition on proper fireplace ventilation. But the Hetairai, they don't sanitize her. They recite her like scripture. In their world, where women are seen, admired, and objectified daily, Sappho gives them a voice, a private voice. She speaks of female desire not just as real, but as worthy of being remembered. One woman tonight, a silver-haired musician named Lysis, sings part of a fragment Sappho wrote for a bride. Raise high the roof beams, carpenters. Hymenaeus is coming, tall as Ares himself. It's a wedding song, but it's about her, about the way she looks, how she moves, the pride in her step. Not about her dowry, not about her lineage, about her. Later, someone brings out a scroll containing the so-called Ode to Anactoria. Dione reads slowly, deliberately. I would rather see her lovely walk and the radiant glance of her face than all the chariots of Lydia. Athens hears that and says, well, that's beautiful. But also, chariots are quite valuable, you know. Classic deflection. Historians still debate the exact nature of Sappho's relationships. Was she writing literal love poems? Was she describing symbolic mentorship? Were these poems performed in ritual? Did she have a school, a circle, a cult? There's no consensus, just fragments, scraps, echoes. But the ambiguity only adds to her allure. In Athens, where intimacy is public and performance is praised, Sappho's work is something rare. Private intimacy made public without losing its softness. A few words scrawled on a ceramic shard, a verse whispered between lovers in the dark, a song hummed into temple stone. From the history of sexuality, Foucault suggests that confession, true deep confession, is a rare thing in ancient societies. But Sappho doesn't just confess. She invites you to confess too, and that's what makes her dangerous and cherished. You leave the villa after midnight, the Acropolis glowing faintly under a crescent moon. A woman walks beside you silently for a few blocks, then says, sometimes I think Sappho wasn't writing for her lovers. She was writing for the ones who didn't love her back. You nod. That feels true. Back at your borrowed room, you find a fig leaf tucked into your sandal strap. No note, just the leaf. You're not sure what it means. Maybe it's a joke, maybe it's poetry. Either way, Sappho would understand. Today, you're waking up early. Far too early, honestly, for something entirely unromantic. A wedding. And before you yawn yourself out of it, don't worry. You're not the bride. You're just attending, watching, taking mental notes. Because in Athens, marriage isn't about love. It's about numbers, dowries, bloodlines, social stability. It's all a finely tuned equation, and you, my sleepy friend, are about to witness the math unfold in real time. You arrive at the house just after sunrise. The courtyard is already bustling, women bustling with linens, an old aunt crying for no reason, and one man sharpening a knife while whistling off key. It's festive, but not joyful. Not exactly. There's tension in the air, because this marriage, like most in Athens, isn't a fairy tale. It's a transaction. The bride is maybe 14, possibly 15. She stands still while her mother braids her hair with ribbons the color of honey and ash. She doesn't smile. She doesn't cry either. She's been prepared for this since before she understood what it meant. The groom is older, at least 30, maybe 35. A respectable citizen, educated, probably owns a small olive grove and at least one philosophical opinion about sheep. He barely knows the bride. He's met her once. She served him wine at a festival, blushed, and that was enough. Her father nodded. The contract was drawn, and now the wedding begins. In the world of Athenian sex, marriage is oddly formal, distant. Marriages aren't about desire, they're about continuation of name, property, citizenship. A man's wife is the guardian of the oikos, the household. She's expected to bear children, preferably male, manage the home, and never be seen gossiping in the street. Love? Optional. Dangerous, even. A man could fall in love with his wife, yes, but then he might lose his edge. That's what the playwrights joke. A wife who smiles too much must be trying something. A husband who weeps at home is probably no good in the assembly. The ceremony is brief, a ritual bath, an offering to Hera, then a quiet feast, gamos, with music, riddles, and roasted lamb. There's a torch procession where the bride is led, veiled and silent, to her new home. Not arm in arm with the groom, but escorted by relatives. She doesn't speak. She keeps her eyes down. Her husband waits at the door with a cup of wine. This moment, the crossing of the threshold, is symbolically massive. It marks her transition from daughter to wife, from one oikos to another. She walks in, is shown the hearth, then led to the wedding bed, where friends sing songs that are suggestive, to say the least. You hear one sung from the courtyard as you wait with the other guests. Lift her high as fruit from vine, bring her sweet to drink the wine. Charming, awkward, entirely expected. In some homes, the bed is sprinkled with pomegranate seeds, a fertility charm. In others, with tiny fish bones, which no one explains to your satisfaction. There's even a fringe tradition where guests bang pots outside the room to encourage the couple. You suspect the couple just waits until everyone leaves and eats leftovers instead. From Sex with Kings, Eleanor Herman reminds us that royal marriages were often little more than alliances sealed with silk and ceremony. The Athenian version isn't much different. Only here, everyone pretends it's sacred, even when everyone knows it's strategic. The next morning, the bride receives gifts. Not romantic tokens, no pearls or love poems, but household items, wool, looms, kitchen utensils. Her real dowry was already paid in silver, cloth, and sometimes livestock. It's now locked in legal agreements, waiting to ensure that, should the marriage fail, she can at least return to her father's house with something. Historians still argue whether women had real power in these arrangements or were entirely at the mercy of male relatives. The truth likely lies somewhere between. Some women learn to manipulate these systems quietly. Others live their whole lives barely seen. And yet, love still happened. There are whispered stories of husbands who adored their wives, of girls who sent secret notes before marriage, of wives who took lovers cautiously, and even of marriages that began as numbers but bloomed into something softer. You meet one older woman at the edge of the wedding feast. She's sipping wine, laughing under her breath, eyes sharp as sewing needles. "He married me for my father's vineyard," she says, "but I stayed for his bread making." You ask if it was love. She shrugs. It grew. She raises her cup. Not all wine starts sweet. You like her immediately. You also notice who isn't at the wedding. The hetairai, the flute girls, the women who speak too loudly in public. They live in a different Athens, one filled with laughter and freedom, but no legal protection. No marriage contracts, no ceremonies. This bride will be protected by law, but trapped in expectation. Those women are free to flirt, but free fall if they fall too far. It's a city divided not by affection, but by function. From the history of sexuality, Foucault observed how societies structure desire through institutional roles. Who is allowed to feel and when and how safely. In Athens, marriage is the container for female sexuality. Everything else is a leak, a danger. As the sun sets, the guests scatter. The bride disappears behind the wooden door of her new house. The groom pours libations in the courtyard and smiles awkwardly at his friends. And you? You walk home alone under the stars, wondering if she's scared, if she's bored, if she'll ever write a poem, and whether anyone will preserve it. Or if, like so many women of Athens, her story will be spoken in chores, whispered in lullabies, and folded into fabric. Not written, not remembered, unless you do it. The sun's a little too bright this morning, but you're already out, trailing behind a clanging cart full of amphora and a group of men talking loudly about nothing and everything. You're headed to the Agora, Athens' public square, the heart of the city's commerce, politics, debate, and rumor. But today, you're not here for olives or oratory. You're here to follow someone a little more slippery, the flute girl. She's not a named citizen. She doesn't own property. She's not legally allowed to marry a respectable Athenian man. But everyone knows her name. In fact, tonight, it's being whispered under breath by three very different men. One a bored merchant, another a magistrate, and the last a very flustered young poet who's pretending he doesn't recognize her when she passes, though his ears go pink like he's just been caught eating honey cakes before dinner. She's what the Athenians call an olytris, a professional flute player trained to entertain at symposiums. But the flute is only part of the story. She plays music, yes, but she also dances, tells jokes, sings scandalous songs, and knows how to steer conversation just far enough toward mischief without pushing too far. She is paid, she is admired, and she is never invited to weddings. You trail her through the agora. She wears a belt of clinking coins and a robe that drapes just slightly off one shoulder. Her flute is tucked into her sash. She smiles easily, but her eyes are watchful. She knows how this place works. Athens is a city where sex is everywhere and nowhere. It's on the pottery, in the plays, in the alleys. But respectability? That's walled off. Women like her operate in the space outside the walls. No one pretends they don't exist, but few write their names in stone. You pass a stall selling erotic cups, yes, literal cups with painted lovers in precarious positions. And the merchant points at one and says, "That's her, I swear. That's from a real party." The image shows a woman playing a double flute, one leg draped over a man's lap. It could be her, or it could be the idea of her. The line blurs often in Athens. She stops at a corner where a small crowd has gathered for a street performance. A man juggles figs while reciting a verse from Aristophanes. She watches, laughs. Then someone asks her to play. And she does. The sound is high, tremulous, almost bird-like at first. But then it settles into a rhythm that catches people's feet before they even realize they're moving. The flute isn't just background, it shapes the mood. It seduces the air itself. In The Erotic Spirit Through History, Peter Webb suggests that music in ancient societies wasn't entertainment, it was enchantment, especially when played by someone whose entire body was part of the performance. The sound becomes inseparable from the sway of her hips, the arch of her eyebrow, and of course, there's gossip. They say Pericles once followed a flute girl home in full daylight. They say a war nearly broke out when two generals argued over who had paid her more. They say one of the flute girls is actually a noblewoman in disguise. No one knows which parts are true. You spend part of the afternoon in a small wine house near the edge of the agora, listening to two older men reminisce about their favorite alatrides. One says wistfully, "She made me laugh while I wept." The other grunts, "She made me weep while I laughed." Historians still debate how much agency these women truly had. Were they free or simply free-floating? Some were slaves. Others were foreigners with no citizenship rights. Many trained from girlhood in music, dance, and conversation. A few, like the legendary Rhodopis, became wealthy. Most faded into anonymity. But what's certain is this: they knew how to navigate. They knew how to enter a room full of drunk men, tilt the energy just enough, and leave with their reputation intact, or at least intact enough to be invited back. You follow the flute girl that evening to a private home in the hills. The party is already noisy. Men recline on cushions, wine flows freely, and the air smells of roasted nuts and burnt pine. She enters with a laugh that cuts through the clamor, not loud, just precise. And suddenly, she has everyone's attention. She plays, she teases, she matches jokes with the loudest man in the room and somehow wins. One guest, emboldened by wine, tries to pull her close. She smiles, leans in, and pours a full ladle of wine over his head. The room roars. Even he laughs. He'll tell that story for months. Later, you find her sitting on the balcony, feet dangling over the edge, staring at the moon. She says nothing, just hums a few bars of something soft, something slow. You sit beside her, unsure whether to speak. Finally, she says, "Tomorrow, someone will write a poem about me. But it won't be about me." She grins. "Still, it's nice to be remembered." You ask her name. She tilts her head. "Call me Thaleia." Maybe it's true, maybe not. From the history of sexuality, Foucault wrote that in many ancient societies, truth and identity weren't fixed, they were performed. Thaleia, or whoever she really is, performs her name like she performs her songs, fully, brilliantly, and with the understanding that memory is malleable. You walk back to your lodging, her music still in your ears, and you realize that in a city where so many things are written down, laws, decrees, marriage contracts, it's the flute girl's laughter, unrecorded and unrehearsed, that you'll remember most. Not carved in marble, but carved in you. It's late again in Athens, later than you meant to stay out, but the city has a way of pulling you along like a tide. Tonight, the torches flicker lower, the crowds thin, and the moon over the Acropolis is polished to a bright silver coin. You're wandering the edge of town now, where respectable homes give way to courtyards lit by red lanterns. You found your way into the shadowed world of the sex workers, but not the kind whispered about with scandal. These are the women who live at the crossroads of commerce, desire, and survival. Welcome to the world of the porne and hetairai. You pass a brothel marked by a painted sign, a sandal with a winged heel. No words, just the symbol. It's open, always open. Inside, there's low laughter, the smell of wine and lamp oil, and a warmth that's not quite comfort but not far from it either. The women here, the porne, are usually slaves. Owned by a madam, or sometimes a man, they live in the rooms they work in. The place is basic. Mud brick walls, straw mattresses, woven curtains for privacy. Not much glamour, but the mood is professional, like a workshop, a place where bodies are tools and time is measured in coins. You speak to one woman as she lights a clay lamp. She tells you her name is Christ. Like gold, she says without irony. She's from Thrace. She came here when she was 13. She doesn't cry when she says it. She also doesn't smile. Her clients come and go. Most are polite. Some are drunk. A few ask her to sing. One brings her olives every week. Another only wants to lie beside her and talk about his dead dog. She shrugs. Loneliness, she says. That's the real trade. From Sex with Kings, Eleanor Herman reminds us that sex workers often knew more about politics than politicians. They listened. They remembered. And if they survived long enough, they wielded soft power from behind silk curtains. But the real stars of Athenian desire aren't the pornai. They're the hetairai, the companions. These women are educated, often multilingual, and entirely independent. They choose their clients. They attend symposiums, write poetry, give advice. They might sleep with their patrons or not. They might attend your party, dazzle your guests, quote Sappho, drink you under the table, and then leave without a backward glance. You meet one near the agora, late, as she's being walked home by a student who clearly doesn't realize she's out of his league. Her name is Lysandra. She wears perfume that smells of cloves and citrus. Her voice is low, amused, and precise. She tells your 3 rules. 1, never love a man who can't read. 2, never quote a philosopher you haven't slept with. 3, never go to a party where they don't serve fruit. You ask how she got started. She shrugs. Same way everyone does. Beauty, wit, and a refusal to marry my cousin. She's not joking. Hetairai like Lysandra often came from outside the strict citizen class, foreigners, daughters of artisans, women who refused the narrow life offered to Athenian wives. They learned music, conversation, philosophy. They became performers of self. From the history of sexuality, Foucault suggests that the body in antiquity wasn't just a biological thing. It was a site, a political space, a canvas for self-expression. For women like Lysandra, every glance, every gesture, every pause before answering is part of the performance. But don't mistake her life for ease. Being a hetairai is a game of balance. Too cold, you lose clients. Too warm, you inspire jealousy. Too clever, you risk becoming dangerous. One famous hetairai, Aspasia, companion to Pericles himself, was accused of corrupting the youth, the same charge that would later kill Socrates. Her salon became infamous, a place where politics met desire over figs and flute music. Some said she ghost-wrote speeches. Others said she ruled the city from her couch. You ask Lysandra if she ever wants to settle down. She arches an eyebrow, and give up this view? She gestures toward the Acropolis, glowing like a ghost above the rooftops. Then she laughs softer. No one settles. We all just choose how much we'll pretend. You realize listening to her that in a city where women's lives are so often circumscribed by walls, literal and social, hetairai are one of the few allowed to step outside. But the price is constant performance. Historians still argue whether these women were liberated or trapped, whether their independence was real or just a different kind of gilded cage. But perhaps that's the wrong question. Maybe it's not about freedom, it's about authorship. And women like Lysandra write their own scripts. You walk her home, past courtyards where respectable wives are already asleep, dreaming of bread and birth and duty. Her building is modest but tasteful. She kisses your cheek, not suggestively, but with the quiet affection of someone who sees too much to pretend. As you walk back alone, a cat darts across your path. Somewhere, a man is reciting a love poem badly. A flute trills faintly behind a shuttered window. And you think, in this city of philosophers, generals, and playwrights, it's the women no one writes about who might understand Athens best. It's another hazy Athenian morning, and today you're walking into territory rarely mapped, even by the boldest gossips. The bedrooms of married men, and the curious customs of extramarital affairs in ancient Athens. Let's be clear, in this city of symmetry, logic, and endless public debate, fidelity wasn't exactly the marital gold standard. In fact, you'll find that most respectable Athenian men had three categories of women in their lives: a wife to bear children and manage the home, a concubine for pleasure, and a hetera for conversation and companionship. But here's the twist. The arrangement wasn't necessarily secretive. It was understood. Expected, even. That doesn't mean it was simple. You start your day shadowing a man named Theagenes, middle class, educated, wears a tunic too clean for farming. He kisses his wife's forehead barely, adjusts his cloak, and announces he's going to the gymnasium. He won't be back until evening. She nods. She's heard it before. You follow Theagenes not to the gym, but to the house of a courtesan named Calirrhoe, who greets him with a smirk and a tray of honeyed almonds. They exchange no pleasantries. She sits across from him, legs tucked under her like a cat, and begins reading a new comedic play aloud. He interrupts her, twice, to correct the meter. She lets him, but only once with grace. This is foreplay, Athenian style. He'll leave in 2 hours, return home with stories about a lengthy wrestling match, and she'll never ask questions. She doesn't need to. In The History of Sexuality, Foucault describes how power in sexual relationships often hinges on what can be said versus what must remain unsaid. In Athens, the silence between spouses was less about shame and more about social choreography. A wife wasn't expected to ask, and a husband wasn't expected to confess. You wander the market later and overhear a fish seller cracking a joke about his neighbor's evening tutor, a euphemism for an affair so obvious it's practically broadcast from the rooftop. Everyone laughs. No one seems offended. But that doesn't mean feelings aren't involved. From Sex with Kings, we learn that jealousy in these sorts of societies often comes not from infidelity, but from favoritism. If a husband began spending too much time, too much silver, or, God's forbid, too many poems on a lover, he could face ridicule, even political consequences. You see this later in the day when an Athenian senator is brought before the court for mishandling state funds. The real charge? He bought his mistress a small vineyard outside the city. The public outrage wasn't that he had a mistress. It was that he gave her land. A man's affairs were private as long as they didn't become public property. And for the wives, well, that's where things get complicated. Athenian law treated female infidelity with extreme seriousness. A woman caught in an affair could be divorced instantly. Her lover could be prosecuted, sometimes even killed. The assumption was that a wife's body, unlike her husband's, could complicate lineage. A child born of an affair might inherit incorrectly. That Athens could not abide. But did women have affairs? Historians still argue. Some say it was too risky. Others point to coded poetry, graffiti, even fragments of plays that suggest some women did step beyond the threshold. Very carefully, very rarely, and often with someone who could keep a secret under threat of being turned into a tragic hero. One story you hear, shared over figs and a bit too much diluted wine, goes like this. A merchant's wife fell in love with a traveling flute player. She hid notes in loaves of bread, left the back gate unlatched on specific days, and once pretended to be her own maid just to sneak out. It worked for 3 months. Then she vanished. Some say she fled to Lesbos. Others say she was quietly sent to a rural temple to reflect. Her name, if it was ever written, didn't survive. But back to the husbands. You spend the evening with a playwright, thin and dramatic, who insists that the best affairs are the ones that never quite happen. He tells you about a woman he meets in the agora each week. They trade riddles. They've never touched. He swears she once sent him a sandal as a gift. Just one. He hasn't returned it. There's a performance in all this, of course. Athens is a city of masks, literal ones in theater and metaphorical ones in bed. Every affair is both public spectacle and private escape. Every whispered confession is both sincere and rehearsed. Even the statues play along. You pass one of Hermes in the garden of a wealthy man's villa. At the base, someone scratched a crude poem. He kisses not with lips, but with forgetting, and leaves no scent but sandalwood and smoke. From the erotic spirit through history, Peter Webb suggests that ancient love wasn't about happiness. It was about eros, longing, disruption, a force that unsettled rather than comforted. And extramarital affairs in Athens fit this model perfectly. They weren't about affection or compatibility. They were about thrill, status, the exquisite ache of being wanted outside the contract. As the sky darkens, you wander back past the edge in his house. You hear quiet voices through the open courtyard. His wife is humming, maybe sewing, maybe not. And he's telling her about the match he watched at the gymnasium. His words are smooth, practiced. She doesn't interrupt. But there's something about the way she folds the cloth in her lap, too slowly, too precisely. You wonder, does she know? Has she known all along? Probably. You walk home in silence, not because there's nothing to say, but because in Athens, sometimes silence says everything. You wake up with the distant clatter of morning wagons echoing down the marble-paved streets. This is your last full day in classical Athens, at least in this strange, drifting dream of it. The city still hums with its paradoxes. Open markets and secret meetings, rational debate and whispered rumors, blazing temples and dim-lit doorways. But today, as the cicadas warm their wings and the wind lifts the dust from the stones, you're headed somewhere softer, quieter. You're going to talk about love, not desire, not duty, not wine-fueled escapades or acrobatic symposium flirtations, but something rarer in Athens, something slipperier, less defined, and often unspoken. Because for all the sex, the contracts, the rituals, and the public performances, this city doesn't have a perfect word for love as you might think of it today. No all-encompassing Greek version of I love you. Instead, they had categories, variants, like tools in a workshop, like spices in a kitchen. There's eros, desire, need, that spark that disrupts your soul. Dangerous, divine, often inconvenient. There's philia, affection, loyalty, friendship, that bond between comrades or lifelong companions. Solid, comforting. There's agape, a kind of universal love, often associated with the gods, rarely used in daily life. And finally, there's storge, the love of familiarity, family, habit, the way one might love a fig tree they've sat under every summer since childhood. But romantic love, the kind that encompasses sex, companionship, yearning, trust, and tenderness in one messy, vulnerable bundle, Athens doesn't name it. Not precisely, but that doesn't mean it didn't exist. You spend your morning watching an elderly couple walk slowly around the agora. He carries a small sack of nuts. She adjusts the hem of his chiton every few steps. They don't speak. They don't need to. Later you pass a gravestone with an inscription so faint you nearly miss it. It reads, "He smiled when she sang." That's it. No names, no dates, just that. You speak to a young poet, scribbling verses on a wax tablet near the edge of the Acropolis. His eyes are dark-rimmed from sleep. He says he's trying to write a new kind of poem, one where the speaker doesn't dominate the beloved, where he simply sees them. He reads you a line. You were not fire, you were warmth. You tell him it's lovely. He smiles and says he'll probably change it. From the erotic spirit through history, Peter Webb reminds us that even in cultures steeped in spectacle and ceremony, the quietest moments of tenderness leave the deepest mark. A hand held in a crowd, a laugh remembered, a sandal tied without asking. You visit a small home in the Pottery Quarter where a woman makes figurines of lovers, not in embrace, but sitting side by side. Her shelves are lined with little terracotta pairs, one pouring wine for the other, one braiding the other's hair, one resting their head on the other's shoulder. When you ask why she sculpts them this way, she shrugs. Because that's how we sit when we're really tired. That's when we mean it. Love in Athens is rarely dramatic. It's often buried beneath layers of ritual, contract, flirtation, and status. But sometimes it peeks out anyway, in the way someone says goodbye, in the way they argue softly, without needing to win. Historians still argue whether romantic love was truly celebrated in ancient Athens. Some say it wasn't a priority. Others point to fragments of poetry, to stolen glances on vases, to the aching softness in lines from Euripides and Sappho. One fragment reads, "I touched your shoulder, and the world shifted." You spend the afternoon in a quiet courtyard where an old philosopher teaches children how to think. At one point, a boy asks, Can a person belong to another person? The philosopher smiles and says, only if they never try to keep them. You sit under a fig tree, the same tree perhaps, where someone once whispered a poem. The breeze lifts the leaves, the cicadas drone. You think of everything you've seen, the symposiums, the bathhouses, the masked rites and masked lives. And through it all, love, never centered, but always present, lingering like the scent of crushed time on a passing cloak. As evening falls, you walk slowly through the streets. The sky blushes pink over the rooftops. Children laugh in a distant courtyard. Someone plays a flute badly, beautifully. A woman hums a song you swear you heard in a dream. You look back once at the Parthenon, now just a silhouette. You don't wave. You don't need to, because Athens never says goodbye. It just lets you drift gently out of focus. And in that fading silence where no one performs and no one demands and no one asks you to be clever, you finally hear it. The whisper of a city that loved you without ever saying so. Now take a deep breath. You're back in bed, in your own room. The sounds of ancient sandals on marble have faded into the hush of modern silence. Maybe there's a fan spinning softly above you. Maybe it's just the hum of night around your shoulders. Let the images settle. The olive groves, the warm stone, the flicker of torchlight, the scent of crushed herbs and honeyed wine, the laughter of flute girls, the quiet sighs behind curtained doors, the rustle of linen in the breeze. It's okay to forget the details. Let them blur. Because what lingers isn't the facts, it's the feeling, the curiosity, the quiet, half-smiling wonder that history isn't just written in wars and treaties, but in glances and silences, in the way someone tied their sandals in the dark while another watched, pretending not to notice. You've walked through Athens. You've listened in on its secrets, its jokes, its half-confessions, and now it's time to rest. You did well. You're allowed to let go now. There's nothing left to remember tonight. Just the softness of your pillow, the rhythm of your breath, the feeling of being gently held by time itself. Sleep, dreamer. Athens will still be there in the morning.